All right, so in this lesson, we're going to talk about macromolecules. So there's four major types of macromolecules. Macromolecules are basically molecules within your body that do a lot of the different functions that are required by your body. And so those are what we call macromolecules. And so the different types of macromolecules we have, like proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. But before we get into each one, we're going to talk about how each macromolecule is set up. So a macromolecule is actually what we call a polymer. And so a polymer has multiple units bonded together. And instead of units, I actually should have put monomers. Because a single monomer is like a single unit, kind of like a Lego. So if you want to imagine a macromolecule is kind of some kind of a building, but each building or whatever you make from Legos is made up of an individual Lego. So the individual Lego is like a monomer, and then a polymer is like it's like the whole Lego construction or whatever it is. And the process from going from monomer to polymer, or building your Legos or your polymer, is called polymerization. And polymerization is the process of attaching monomers to form a polymer. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over the four types of macromolecules, and we're going to go over each monomer, polymer, what its function, and examples. So our first macromolecule is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are, its monomer is monosaccharide. So its basic building block is a monosaccharide. And so the polymer of the carbohydrates are disaccharides, di being for two, or polysaccharide, poly being for many. And so remember, monomers are kind of the basic building block. The polymer is multiple. And so we use carbohydrates. They provide short-term energy for cells, and we use them for cell structure, to make cell structure. So these are like the things that we use for energy as well as for cell structure. Examples are glucose and fructose and starch. A lot of sugars are carbohydrates. You also have in bread, the starches and pasta. And so, like, I don't know if you heard of carbo loading, but before big races, runners, they'll carbo load. And these carbohydrates, we use them for short-term energy. Now, you might have heard like, oh, I don't want to do carbs, or I don't want to eat carbs, because if you eat too many carbs, what happens to those carbs is, if they're not used for energy, what they do is they become fat. And because we use fat to store long-term energy. And so, in fact, the next one might be about fat. So let's see. So lipids are actually types of fats. So the monomer of a lipid is a glycerol and fatty acid. So you can kind of see here is the kind of the molecule, monomer. And so we have glycerol, and then the glycerol, we call it the head here, and then the tail here are called fatty acids. So if I were to draw it, I would draw the glycerol head, and then these fatty acid, we call them fatty acid chains. So that's what one monomer looks like. So this is one monomer. And then, so if you put a bunch of these together, so it becomes a lipid. And we use lipids for long-term energy storages for cells. So, and then they're material for cell membranes. And so, example of fats, there's saturated, unsaturated fats. Think about animals. Animals, if they need to hibernate, what do? Well, they store all their stuff in blubber or fat, and over time, during the winter, they use up that fat, but it's for long-term storage. Now, we as vain human beings, we don't want a lot of fat, so we try to stay away from some of this stuff. Just FYI, there's fats that are saturated and unsaturated, and so the saturated ones are the ones that are unhealthy for us. Unsaturated are actually good for us, like avocado oil, olive oil. Avocado is a good example of an unsaturated fat. Fish has certain fats that are unsaturated that are better for you. In fact, they're good for you. Some people take fish oil as well. Okay, so lipids is our second example of a macromolecule. Proteins. Proteins are actually one of the most common macromolecules, and so proteins is the polymer itself, but they're made up of amino acids. Okay, so amino acids is the monomer, And then the function, proteins kind of do it all. They help with body processes. We also use them for material, for cell structure. And then it's also, proteins are primarily what an enzyme is made of. So an enzyme is primarily proteins. So what are some examples within our body? Well, structural material, proteins like muscle, that kind of stuff. Hormones. We have hormones like testosterone, estrogen, different types of hormones. Antibodies. So antibodies are used to kind of fight off infection. And enzymes are used for a lot of things. And we'll talk about enzymes more later. And the last one, is nucleic acids. So nucleic acid, they're made up of nucleotides. So the monomer is nucleotides, and then the polymer is nucleic acid. And then the function is to store and transmit genetic information. The two common ones are DNA, RNA. So within our nucleic acids, that's where our information. So when we pass on our genetic material to our offspring, like our kids, the reason why they look like us is because they share the same DNA. They have the same genetic information. That genetic information kind of dictates what we look like, diseases we might have, that kind of stuff. So those are the four. You have nucleic acids, if we go back, proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. If I were to focus on my studying, I would focus on this, and I would know the monomer, the polymer, the function, and examples of each one. That would be probably the most important thing you need to know.